You're listening to the ASPRA podcast with Sue Whatman. And today we are speaking with Professor John Quay and Abby Boyer from the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne. And they're here to tell us today about their work in creative PE. Welcome, John.
Hi there, Sue.
Hi, and welcome, Abby.
Hi, Sue. How are you?
Wonderful. I'm so pleased that you can join us today on the podcast. So we're here to talk about creative PE, and perhaps a nice starting place is to talk about where the ideas behind it came from.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Sue. And again, thanks very much for having us. Creative PE, the ideas started in the early 2000s, and I was working with Jacqui Peters, who's now at Deakin University, but Jacqui and I were working at Melbourne, and we were working in primary teacher education, and we were trying to work through the issue of a limited amount of time with students and the amount of content we needed to get through in physical education, with a range of models, sitting on the library shelf, kits and things, and so the idea came through of, well, do these models actually support each other? And we've seen other people do that with, sport education and taking personal and social responsibility with Ellison's work. So we looked at combining sport education, TPSR, Ellison's work, also TGFU, game sense, fundamental motor skills, and also game creation. So we thought, oh, well, these are all the things we'd like to teach, and how do we sort of present them in a coordinated, coherent way? And I've got a bit of background in outdoor ed, so we're also thinking about how if we planned a unit of PE for children, for young people at school, could we do it with the thought that it might be a bit of a journey, like a middle school outdoor ed bushwalk or something like that, where the people know they've sort of they're starting somewhere and they're heading somewhere. So those sort of thoughts came together, and we ended up with creative PE. And one of the main factors of it is, rather than starting with fundamental motor skills, which is often the way, especially in primary, we started at the other end with the TPSR, with the Ellison work. They're taking personal social responsibility, especially as that related to being in a team. So a bit of a flip, but yeah, that's where the ideas sort of came from.
That is fantastic. And how did you first come across creative PE, Abby?
I was introduced to creative PE when I started working with John at Melbourne in 2018. And I was working with primary schools at the time. And then I saw the value in how it could link in a cross-curricular way as well. And so I was teaching at a secondary school, teaching physical education. And so I introduced it to my staff and students, and primarily taught it in year 8 and 9, especially during the lockdown time as well. So I adapted the model to suit online learning as well.
Okay, so I know that some of the key features of creative PE are concepts like backward design, inquiry-based learning, structural criteria. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I'll jump in, Abby? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Sue. So as linked to what I was saying before about the notion of a journey, we're sort of trying to think, well, backward design, where are we headed with the unit? But rather than merely positioning the content descriptions or the curriculum or the knowledge and skills at the end of the unit, as you would as a teacher, we were trying to think, well, what would the end goal of the unit be from the students' perspectives? So how could we set something up that they were really working towards achieving? So that was the backward design notion. And in getting there, and there are a range of steps in getting there, if you do the whole thing. And just as an aside, we're very keen to put forward the idea that there's no sense of fidelity. We're not if you want to have a crack at this, there's no right or wrong. Just play with any of it. But there are many inquiries on the way. So the first inquiry, in a sense, and it's an ongoing one, is what does it mean to be a good team member? Then how do we develop a game? What sort of game are we going to play? And the skills are enveloped in that, as well as strategies. And that game then is inserted into a little season of games. And there's some practice as well as collaborative play through the season. So with all of that, though, and with all those steps, and it becomes clear with the game, rather than starting with rules and rather than starting with a game that is an adult game or a game that the teacher's familiar with, we ask the students to develop the game. And in order to do that, we present them with a list of criteria or variables, but we've started using the word criteria because some of these criteria will be in a rubric that you will assess. So the criteria, the basic ones that, we're sort of talking about are, the game you create has to be fun. It has to include everyone in the class. Everyone needs to be able to play the game, and that is the full range of diversity of the class. So not just thinking of, the good players potentially, but, if someone's in a wheelchair, they need to be able to play this game. I'll keep going. So whatever skills you want to teach and to make sure you have covered, they need to be in the game. There's equipment, and we provide each team with the same equipment. So they can then create games and teach them to other teams and know the other team's got further equipment that they can use together to try out the game that they're working on. And Abby, can you think of, what are some of the other criteria? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
The scoring and the safety.
Yeah, so that's really important because safety, of course. So, the students need to be aware of that. And scoring, that raises the question about CPEP and sport education, that in this way of teaching, we're not assigning roles to students. We want them all to be able to participate in the scoring, help coach others and all that. And in a lot of ways, we're modelling it on what they're capable of organising and doing at recess and lunch and after school, where we see them organising a lot of their own things. Sorry, Abby?
I think when you talk about the analogy with CPEP, that was a great way for my teachers to understand the concept of what we were doing in terms of creating a competition, but not necessarily based on a particular sport. And the TPSR, the teaching personal and social responsibility, is the real point of difference for me in creative PE. So we begin with understanding what it means to be a great teammate. And with Hallison's levels, what stood out to me was that lots of my high-performing students are at level 3. They're really good at executing the game. They follow the rules. They're always very enthusiastic. And the distinction between level 3 and level 4 is that at level 4, you are helping everyone else become a great team member and improving the performance of the whole team. And of course, my students all want to be operating at level 4. And so I saw a shift in the way that they participated within their team when they had that understanding. To initially illustrate how those team levels work, what we do is we have them in their teams and they create a little role play. It doesn't have to be about sport. It could be about lining up at the canteen. And the other teams have to guess, okay, within that role play, which person was the level 0 who was disruptive? Normally the easiest one to pick out, by the way. Which person was the level 1 who was kind of there, not disruptive, but not particularly having any input into the situation or the game? And once they've got an understanding of those teammate levels, we use them consistently in every lesson for the students to self-identify where they were operating. And what happened in a couple of my classes, my year 8 classes, was that the teachers of English and science were like, what are you doing with this class? Because they keep talking about these games. And then they adopted the language that we were using within that. And also it's quite dynamic. In secondary PE or secondary classes in particular, I don't always assume that students are going to turn up with a book or a pen or any of those kinds of materials. And so I gave each student a peg and they put their name on the peg. And then when we were outside, there's usually fences and we would allocate a part of the fence. That part is level 4, level 3, level 2. And they would go and put their own peg just on where they thought they were operating. And then routinely during the lesson, we would stop, say 20 minutes in, say, just have a think about what level you've been operating on at the moment. And then they would go and move their peg to where they thought they were. And that also helped them to reflect on how when people's pegs, when they were rating themselves at level 3 or 4, how that impacted their performance and productivity as a team. So I always kept linking back to that social emotional sort of reflection and learning that was really beneficial to the team.
And if I can jump in, Abby, thanks so much for that. And so one of the questions might be, why are we using this TPSR and the levels in this way of teaching? And well, two big points here. One is that we want to shift the motivation, the disciplinary understanding away from the teacher having to sort of enforce what it meant to be a good team member, teammate. So you're not being good, you're in trouble, sort of thing. To the understanding that if most of the people in your team are operating at levels 3 and 4, then no matter what else is happening, you've got a good team because people are looking after each other and wanting to contribute. So the motivation then in the explanation to the students about the team levels is about being a good team member. You need to sort of move up those levels. Another thing associated with it is that later on, when we have the students, because we usually work with 4 teams, divide a class into 4 teams. So we want 2 teams working with each other at the same time and, potentially playing games, with each other. And often in PE, it's the teacher who's the umpire or referee. So we need those games to be able to be played without the teacher being the referee or the umpire. So and so that framework, that TPSR framework, where if you like, the criterion is, understands what it means to be a good team member and the quality descriptors are those levels, then that's in play as well to help manage their behavior and their contributions when we get to a time when, they're playing games, with each other and the teacher isn't, just umpiring the whole thing, but it's more like a, quality classroom teaching where the students will be working in table groups or something, especially that model in primary schools. And the teacher isn't directing everything that's going on, but once activities are underway, they can monitor and they can visit tables and they can support and provide feedback, etc. And one last thing about the criteria is that now that, the criteria for the team, the criteria for the games, the students now have the expectations for what we want as teachers to see them able to do. And so they can provide feedback to each other. So as we get the games working and the teams develop sort of draft games, then we can stop. And so we stop sorry, let me take a step back. Once they've developed something that might work, then they'll teach it to another team. The other team will teach them their version, and they can sit down as a team and provide feedback to the other team. So we also use booklets or other methods, so you can actually think about the criteria that we're using for games. And as a team, you can agree on what feedback you want to provide to the other team. And so they can have that feedback and further develop their game, and you can receive the feedback from them. And that sort of round robin structure of developing a game, sharing it with another team, getting feedback, giving feedback, we do for a number of classes.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like that really you're enabling students to really sit nicely in that social aspect of physical education, and to divorce it from, as you said, teacher direction, teachers defining all the roles, teachers defining all of the limits of what we're learning today. And so it's all bit student-centered. It's a little bit about the idea of peers teaching each other. Really love the idea of that students not only get to know what the criteria is for a team or quality PE, but that they get to self-assess themselves against it. And I think I see a lot of those concepts coming out in papers around our meaningful PE. You see a lot of that as well. I want to come back to you, Abby, in a minute about an example from your COVID teaching. But before I do, I want to go back to you, John, around what happened when you took this to Finland. So I read your article with Kokkonen and Kokkonen about introducing this model, and particularly the team and the season in a Finnish middle school. Was it a middle school?
Primary and
middle.
Yes.
And I know that, the end of the article sort of said, Finland has given Australia many things, but this is something Australia has given Finland. So perhaps if you want to talk me through a little bit, like what you noticed was different about those schools and how creative PE met a need for them.
Yeah, well, middle school PE in Finland is quite similar to Australian middle school PE, where you've got multiple sports, and PE is closely associated with sport. And so teachers will run units on particular sports. And so the teacher is often the main font of knowledge, and, directs and drives the teaching in that regard. And I remember watching, they have some different sports over there than we might. So I think there's Finnish baseball and, things that, we wouldn't normally sort of work with. And so what the people I was working with were in a city called Jyväskylä, which is in the middle of Finland. And the university there is the only place where you can learn how to be a physical education teacher. And so it was of interest to them because it shifted the way they were thinking about physical education into forms of pedagogy that more aligned with the forms of pedagogy that were used in other parts of the school and other subjects. So, like I was saying before, one of the things that was driving us, initially with developing this was being aware of high quality classroom teaching in the primary school and in the secondary school, so that it's not different than any high quality teaching. And so we're trying to bring that into the phys ed space, where often the question, are we coaching, are we teaching, some of these things that have plagued us for a long time are there. And so I've continued to work with Juha Kokkonen and others over there, and so it's been a really good partnership, and learning from them learning from us, and also thinking about their curriculum and how they run that, but that's a whole nother story. Thanks, Sue.
Well, situating the social in, I mean, that's something we are always grappling with, and particularly with online teaching and learning. And so that's why I thought I'd come back to you, Abby, about your example when you're thinking that you wanted to apply the creative PE model, particularly during lockdown. So what did that look like?
Uh, it was in Google Classroom that I constructed this. I really wanted a chance for my students to feel like they were focusing on the practical element of physical education, which was hard to do while we were in lockdown. And I had 5 year 8 and 9 PE classes during lockdown. And so I had each team, so that, like John said, there's 4 teams in a class. Each team construct a Bitmoji classroom, which is basically a digital room. And so in their classroom, they had to draw out the playing field or the court. They had to create a Bitmoji. I don't know if you saw year 8s and 9s during lockdown, but they never turned their screens on. So building an identity without being able to see each other was a challenge that I wanted to kind of address with this opportunity. And then they had all of the criteria and they had to address that during lessons. And the great thing about the digital world is that everything is time stamped and you can see whose name is it attributed to certain things. And so it was very visible for the team who was contributing and talking about creating the rules, creating the game. They might, like John said, you choose specific skills. So say it might be a shoulder pass that you want to do. And so in their Bitmoji classroom, there might be a link from a basketball that went to an instructional video that they did exhibiting the skill. And then they might have, sorry, there's one of our PE teachers calling me. So all of the criteria that we're talking about that you check your game against, I had them build that first because what I really wanted to do was as soon as we got back from lockdown, I wanted to jump straight into prac. Because as a phys ed teacher in a secondary school, you might only see them once or twice a week. So you want them to be as active as possible. And so they created these rooms and they gave each other feedback and they wrote comments on, is everyone allowed to shoot in this? Or one of the criteria, for example, is when we talk about scoring and timing, it should be 5-minute halves. That is something that comes up in the feedback when they play it with each other. What I've often found is the groups they look at all the equipment and think, oh, I'm going to create like this obstacle course and everyone can get over and through the equipment and you have to, and then the game, and then what they don't realize until they play it with another team is that the game's over. And so they haven't reached the criteria of the 5-minute halves. Because what we want is for it to expand into a whole class game. So from the online Bitmoji rooms, they had their rules, they had the equipment they would need, they had the skills that they would be focusing on. And this was all, I wanted to enhance their ICT capacity as well. They created a script that exhibited the teammate levels. And then they were able, because they became really familiar with this and we did it over a number of weeks, by the time we got back on campus, they were able to go straight out and practice their games and talk about the rules that they had and then go straight into, after that practicing, which is the first draft, they then match up with one of the other groups. So team 1 and team 2 get together and they compete one of the games against each other, and that's how they get the feedback. Because the other team uses the criteria. It might be through the booklet. It might be because I've laminated the criteria for them. And after they've played the game, they look at it and say, well, it was great, but was everyone able to participate? Because that's one of our criteria. We want everyone to participate. So how could we adjust the rules or the formation or the environment so that we can get everyone to participate? Because we said that we don't want any outs. Because when you have outs, you have people not participating, so they're not improving. So I found that it was a really cohesive way for my classes to feel bonded in that transition from online learning to on-campus learning. And like I said, then some of the other core teachers in their classes started to adopt some of the language and the interest in the games and the competition. And like any teacher who's run a really great CPEP unit knows, when it runs really well, you as the teacher are just stepping back and watching them organize themselves and run themselves, make improvements, and you're facilitating that. So it was really lovely experience.
Oh, that's wonderful. We have a very short CPEP unit in what used to be like a what you'd call the last subject before they went out and graduated, and now it's a little bit further back in the degree. It's in third year. But when we had a day where they had to design the games and how long the halves were, they started off playing 10-minute halves in the game, and then sort of halfway during the day they're going, "Oh, can we cut that back to 5?" They were toasted. They were completely wrecked. But they were, engaging in those sorts of things that you've described. But yeah, 5 minutes on paper, they might think that doesn't sound long enough to really have a decent play. But by the time you're actually rolling through a program, it's more than enough time, isn't it? Yeah, John. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute at the moment, John.
Sorry about that. Another thing with the 5-minute halves is that when that game is inserted into some form of season, so that's the sort of the final phase of the unit. If you want to go all the way there, we wanted to make sure that there was enough time in a lesson that the students could analyse how their performance went and work out ways to improve. So just like any class, you wouldn't just, like a maths class, you wouldn't just have a test every week. So you couldn't just have a competitive game every week and not have time for them to think about, well, what could we do better? How could we improve various aspects? And those aspects often, skills, strategies, and fitness. And so teams thinking about that and then co-designing ways to improve. And so the skills, as Abby and I were saying, we want them incorporated in the games right from the beginning. Those, and we know that the techniques that people have identified for particular skills, they're not rocket science, and children are quite capable in class to think, well, what do you need to do a good throw, to do a good shoulder pass, to do whatever, and to have a discussion about that, make suggestions, and then the skill, then their relationship with the skill is so much closer. It's a skill in their game that they're analyzing, suggesting techniques for, which they can then use to analyze their and others' performance in their team. So again, it's sort of taking the teacher off center stage, and by doing so, it's enabling a much more increased amount of feedback to be able to be provided in class on your skill performance. Go, Abby. Yeah.
When you talk about the feedback in class as well, John, I think it's important to note that when you created this, it wasn't just for the PE specialist. So I'm a PE specialist, but there's Jacqui ran a study where there was 4 generalist grade 4 teachers running this that then became a competition. And so it can be run by the generalist, but there's also great opportunity for the partnership between the PE teacher and the generalist, because the PE teacher, of course, has a limited amount of time outside. So developing that partnership, there's a lot of scope in this particular model.
Yeah, there's quite a big expectation on classroom teachers to meet the personal development and a lot of the social and health components of a HPE curriculum. And this would be a really wonderful way to scaffold that for generalists who might think, oh gosh, I'm not a PE teacher, I can't do this. But you say, oh, actually, I can do that. And so certainly they can do it when you're handing over so much of the decision making and enactment to the students.
Yeah, and that's what we found, because we're aware too that I'm not sure if you find this, Sue, where you are, but each year, with the primary initial teacher education cohort, there's a significant percentage that haven't enjoyed physical education in their own education. And so for many of them, knowing that in some schools, physical education will be taught by the classroom teacher. Not every school has a specialist. And even if the classroom teacher isn't teaching it, the fact that they know how it might work and that it can work in the ways that they think they can teach, is something that we wanted to leave them with at the end of the PE they did in their initial teacher education degree. So they would finish their time with us feeling that, they didn't have to be a sporty person to actually teach PE. There was their identity as a teacher, as a classroom teacher sort of embedded in this, and that they could conduct it, as well. Yeah, so.
Very good. Well, look, before we wrap up today, I guess I'd like to ask you, what's next for you as the creative PE team?
Should I go, Abby?
Yeah, I think for me, just the point, John, that it's not just PE, this model, this idea of creating learning units in something that they engage in, that they create themselves. It's not something they had to come and do in my class. They owned it, and it's not just for PE. So that broader scope, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Yeah, so because that came too when we also applied this with dance, and haven't got time to go into all that, but having games and dance as two possible versions made us realise that we had a framework here rather than just a way of teaching PE. And so the framework, now we've sort of evolved into a unit planning framework that can be applied in any subject. And so we're working on pursuing that and sharing those ideas, in schools and with initial teacher education students. Yeah. Sorry.
And so if I have run very successful dance programs, and if I can do it through creative PE, then it must work, because it is often the unit. I know from talking to my colleagues that it's often the unit that my colleagues dread to teach.
Yeah. I remember bush dance.
Yeah. Just the bush dance in grade 4. Yeah.
Oh, well, look, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today on the ACHPA podcast. We'll put some links in the bio underneath the podcast, which can refer to our listeners to some more reading of some of the great stuff that you've done. And hopefully that will inspire them also onto a creative learning and teaching approach, and perhaps to learn more about your framework. So thank you once again.
Thanks heaps, Sue.
Thanks, Sue.